Before getting started, I did want to say a huge thank you to all of you. Meredith and I were able to get away for the little trip down to Raleigh to go see our alma mater, NC State. And if you didn't know, that is actually the first time Meredith and I have been able to get away, just us, in the last 5 years, really since Phoebe's been born. So it was greatly appreciated. I think it came at a good time for Meredith and I to kind of, reconnect a little bit. So before we get into it, I did just want to make certain that I stopped and just said, from the bottom of my heart, thank you, not just for getting a random gift during an October, but thank you for the continued opportunity to being able to serve this church family. This is something that God has put on my heart. It's important for our community to be able to provide this kind of family and this kind of community for people who want to relate to God in ways that maybe aren't kind of the traditional small little country church way. So once again, thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to serve you in a way that God has called me. The two greatest commandments that Jesus Christ gives us is to love God and to love others. But oftentimes when we talk about these greatest of commandments, what ends up happening is we focus more on the love others and not so much on the love God, even though the way Jesus puts it is that love God is the most important. And when you stop and you actually consider what that means and the implications and what can go wrong when you prioritize loving people over loving God, it actually becomes far more profound than you may expect. When we revisit that story of Jesus getting anointed in Bethany, we can see an example, just a small microcosm of what this looks like to love God over loving people. Because you see, you could easily look at the disciples and say, well, they were looking after the poor. Shouldn't we be looking after the poor? Now, there were some other things going on that we've covered in some previous messages, but that is a reaction I think you can see in many Christians today. As soon as a church says, we feel called to send individuals to this community or to this country to go spread the gospel, you don't have to wait long before somebody says, well, why are we going to spend those resources there? I mean, can't we spend that money better on needs in our own community? Never mind the fact that they're not currently meeting those needs in the community. You see, sometimes what happens is we want to replace what God is calling us to do with His dominion and with His knowledge of all of creation with what we think makes sense in our heads. And there's a key problem with that. I have yet to meet the individual who has ever loved so completely, so deeply, and so perfectly as we see in the person of Jesus Christ. And if that is the case, and if that's something we can agree with, then we have to stop and ask ourselves, why wouldn't we want to love God first? Now, when we talk about loving God, you then have to say, like, what does that actually mean? Does it just mean that you hide in your church all the time and you just pray and you just sing songs? Well, no. Jesus gives us a very clear lesson on what that means to love God first. And that is exactly what we see in an interaction between Peter and himself after he has already died and raised from the dead. There's a little bit of wordplay that's actually taking place in this conversation between Peter and Jesus. Because you see, they're using two different words here, or two different meanings for the word love. And whether this is something that was actually a part of the live conversation or the way that John wrote it down, it is interesting, because what you can actually see in here is that Jesus is asking, do you love me? And the word he keeps using is agape. Do you unconditionally love me? And the word that Peter keeps coming back with, saying, of course I love you, is phileo, which is more of like brotherly love. Of course I love you. Now, the nuanced difference between those two is unconditional versus conditional, limited, something with bounds on it. And Peter keeps coming back that way. And I think if we were to be honest with ourselves, many of us are probably guilty of doing the same thing. If I were to come up and just say, do you love Jesus? You know, especially if the pastor or another person in the church, do you love Jesus? You're going to go, yeah, of course. I mean, what kind of question is that? Of course I love Jesus. Yeah, but do you really love Jesus? And are you willing to do what that love compels you to do? Because I'll tell you what that love doesn't necessarily mean. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're singing the best or that you put on the best religious productions. It doesn't necessarily mean that you participate in all of the correct things, but it does mean that you love so deeply that maybe it doesn't even make sense to you. I think sometimes we get so wrapped up in what we think that love and compassion and grace can be that we forget that our concepts of all of those things is woefully insufficient. If we could have done those things deep enough that it truly made us righteous and pure and holy, then we wouldn't have needed Christ. But what we see is that Christ was essential in order to show us what true love, what true compassion for other individuals actually means. And so you see there's a very logical reason why the primary command is to love God. And it's because God has been the only force known to mankind that has ever truly, selflessly, boundlessly, and unconditionally loved other individuals. And let me tell you right now, if I had a choice between a faith that's based on what human beings think love can be versus the God who has actually demonstrated to us unconditional love, I'll choose God every single time. So the question for you today is, which is more important to you? The lovey-feely stuff that a lot of people want to make religion and Christianity out to be? Or do you love God? And as a result of loving God, you're going to go and love God's creation. That's our lesson that I have for today. I hope you're able to get something out of it. And until we can meet again, God bless.